here with a swimming author and prolific writer, coach, Andrew. Introduce yourself. Where'd you start swimming, and what was it like early in your coaching career?
Sure. So I started swimming pretty late. I started when I was about 15 when I got to high school. And so, I was obviously pretty far behind from a technical standpoint. And my first experiences, I was almost so bad that just working hard, really helped me improve. And, so I kind of took that path. I didn't really appreciate the value of skill development because, I was growing and getting faster, without it. And then so I ended up going to college in swimming, and that's where it became pretty obvious that my skills were really holding me back, and so that really changed my perspective on the sport. And then decided to get into coaching after swimming, and made a couple stops at Maryland, at Bucknell University, at Northwestern University, and the University of Virginia. And along the way, just kind of continued to realize how important the skill aspect of the sport is. And really the fastest swimmers are the best swimmers. And it became, a process of how to best help swimmers learn these skills, because ultimately, I or whoever, you as a coach, you may know the best way for a swimmer to move through the water. But if they're not able to actually do that, if you can't communicate that knowledge, if you can't help them understand that knowledge, it doesn't really matter. And so that became, the biggest, challenge for me was, one, figuring out what are really fast swimmers actually doing, and then figuring out how to help other swimmers that don't have those skills learn those skills.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to say that the swimming's an engineered sport, where our physical bodies have to apply the pressures, and there's ways to reduce drag and go faster, or there are ways to suffer. And
Right.
the guys and gals that are swimming with the best technique, and that's sort of what you try to hone in on. So isn't that one of your core principles as far as what you stand for, or what you're trying to preach?
Yeah. So I think that skill development is really huge, and I think that part of the problem is we tend to see skills or sort of technique and training as two different things, and that's always going to cause a problem, because as coaches, everyone recognizes that swimmers have to be fit, and so that's going to be a huge part of what happens on a day-to-day basis, and it can be hard for anyone to kind of merge the traditional ways of thinking about skill development, which is, just some basic drills and coach-led feedback and instruction. And then how does that rectify with, or how does that align with, really challenging training sets? And so, the approach that I've started to take is how can you integrate your skill development into your training, so that rather than having technique and training as two separate things, it's really one part of the whole same process. And that way, you don't really have to sacrifice either, and you get the best of both worlds. And not only are you able to do both things at the same time, they actually make each other better.
Exactly, and that's like blended learning, right? You're blending your technique at the top of your training, and then what other types of teaching do you think it's important for the coaches to do with the students or with the athletes, beyond just the practice time?
What's really important is that they understand the basic ideas of what kind of creates speed. I don't think that they have to know, I don't think communication in terms of your elbow should be bent at 103 degrees. I don't think that type of stuff is particularly relevant, but I think that it is valuable. You mentioned it earlier. If you go through the water straight, you're going to create a lot less resistance than if you're going through the water, moving side to side or moving up and down or all over the place. And I think that those, as one example, that simple principle is really important for swimmers to understand. And when they have the basic idea of what they're trying to accomplish, and same thing, if you want to move forward, you have to move water backwards. And if you're using a really small paddle by just using your hand, that's not going to be super effective. But if you have this big hook where your whole arm is creating propulsion, then that's going to be a lot more effective. I think those type of things are really important to communicate. And then you have something to kind of reference back to when you're doing some of these sets. You can say to someone, hey, remember, you got to be like a streamlined rocket ship as opposed to this, barge. And then they can start to make those connections in a simple way versus you're like, well, you need to move your head 9 degrees lower. You need to move your head, 8 degrees to the left. That's not going to work in a training context, because it's too precise. And also, again, like swimmers have to be, they're going to be working hard, they're going to be training. They needed some big picture concepts to wrap their heads around, as opposed to, some really minute details.
Well, these days I'm considering you like a big brother in a sense that you're a coach of coaches.
Mm-hmm.
Is that sort of a fair statement, or
I think that I'm trying to help provide other coaches with strategies that can make their lives, one can make help their swimmers swim faster, and also make their lives easier. Because one of the challenges that I certainly faced was, it's impossible. Like, most people are not coaching 5 athletes at a time. That's not a reality for most coaches. And even then, that can be difficult to manage, really providing awesome feedback and awesome instruction to, that few swimmers. And when you're dealing with 30 swimmers, or something along that lines, you need different strategies to actually help them improve their skills. Because if you are the one that's driving that process by, providing instruction and feedback exclusively, there's no way you're going to be able to interact with all those swimmers every single practice in an optimal way. And so, and not only is that less effective, it's really stressful. It's hard. Like you're constantly, it's almost like a chicken with it running around with its head cut off. You're just trying to put out fires, and you're trying to help things. And it just is, stressful, basically. And so, my big thought process is, how can we design, basically sets and learning environments that allows swimmers to learn, but don't require, the constant interaction with one single individual swimmer, because that's just not scalable.
yes. And then what coaches or what type of settings of coaches, are gravitating and really, absorbing your lessons? Is it the club coaches, or is it the college coaches, or is it the high school coaches?
Yeah, I think it's more, I've had some interaction with NISCA, the high school coaching federation. I think that it's all over the spectrum, because I think what I tried to look for is the underlying principles. So rather than finding a specific strategy that works for a specific type of swimmer or a specific type of coach, it's what are the things that matter for fast swimming, and what are the best ways to help swimmers learn those skills regardless of the situation. You may have to, you're obviously not going to do the same thing with an 8-year-old that you are with, someone who's training for the Olympic Games, but the same principles do apply. And so I think that it has applicability. And, I hear back from coaches of all sorts of levels. So, certainly college coaches, and then, not quite learn to swim, but almost people that are working at the introductory stages of the age group process. And the same ideas all apply, because you have the same basic problem, regardless of what age or what ability level the swimmer is. They have to learn new skills, and they have to do it while, basically learning it in some sort of training context. Because even if, the reality is you have to swim a lot to get better at swimming. And so there's no way around that. Even if you're doing, the best activities, it still takes time, because it's a learned skill, and you have to practice it. So, and that applies regardless of the situation. So trying to help coaches learn how to design more effective sets so that learning can take place while still training hard.
Well, you wrote a book, and since the book, what other tips have you picked up, about the profession, about, communicating with coaches, about, the challenges they face, to give us a sort of some, recent snapshot of, what's fueling your fires, and what's fueling your, your urge to keep, the communicating, and to keep the call.
Right. So I think that the biggest thing is being as effective as possible in helping to, or in communicating the basic principles that, is easily accessible to everyone, and then providing specific strategies so that they can start to use those. And I think what's also important is, coaches use many of the strategies that I like to advocate for already, but they may not do so in a systematic way, and they may not do so in every way. So they may use, the exactly what I'm talking about in one area of coaching, or one specific skill, and then they don't necessarily see that they can apply that same thought process to not only a different skill, but probably every skill. And so that's what I think is you know, what I'm really focusing on is in helping people learn to start think about things differently, because I think we tend to think about skill development in, I know what it's supposed to look like. I'm going to tell the swimmer what to do. They're going to try to do it. And then I'm going to let them know if they're doing it well or not. And that just kind of goes back and forth, where I think I'm trying to help people understand and help coaches understand that if you give them the right type of activities, you can help them solve 90% of the skill development problems without really having to tell them very much. And when you can start to do that, you're going to be a lot more effective in terms of helping every single swimmer, you know, even the ones that don't, you know, quote unquote, don't get it. Like those are the ones that you can almost help the most, because they stand a much better chance of figuring it out. And then also you can really start to train these skills hard. And that's what's going to be required for it to show up in races.
So what, you know, you got the book. People should read the book. It's a great book. You know, it's on Amazon, I imagine. And
Yep.
and where, but what other things are you doing? Are you doing clinics? Are you going to do camps? Are you coaching now? What's your how do
Sure.
people get a hold of?
Yeah. So if they go to my website, which is coachandrewsheaff.com, there's some other resources there. And there's, you know, a short video course, which they can check out, which is just an easy introduction to everything, so that they can start to grasp the kind of the practical aspect of everything. And then, you know, I'm working with a few clubs and just kind of helping them start to implement these ideas, because ultimately, if you can, you know, start some of this stuff from the you know, their swimmer's first kind of interaction with the club, you know, they're going to have skills by the time that they reach the senior level. And the other thing too is, like, you know, the more skill development they have, the better chance that they're going to continue to improve. And if they continue to improve, they're going to stay in your club. And that's going to be an important aspect of, you know, just the club in terms of performance, and also from a business standpoint. If kids aren't staying in the sport, like, you know, I'm sure every coach can calculate how much it costs if a kid quits at age 12 versus age 18. It's not a small amount of money. And so, you know, kind of helping people systematize these things so that they can be consistent with, you know, help kids learn. They're going to swim faster. If they're going to swim faster, they're going to keep swimming more likely than not.
Well, can you give me like a win, or, you know, a small victory that you've had, you know, working with a club, or, you know, an organization and their staff? You know, what are a couple, or one thing that?
Yeah, sure. So you know, one of the big things that I talk about is, you know, I think that something as simple as counting strokes can be super effective across all the different age ranges and most skills. And so, you know, there was a call I did with a club, you know, a couple weeks ago, and that was you know, one of the biggest things was just helping coaches understand that how much easier that can make your life by simply having kids count their strokes. Because one, it makes it objective. You know, if you're concerned that a swimmer isn't maintaining their skills, like if they go from 14 strokes to 16 strokes or whatever it is, like there's no argument there. You know it's changed. The swimmer knows it's changed, and so that's going to facilitate, you know, them making that correction on their own. Whereas opposed to, like, if you're like, your breathing's not as good as it was before, that's kind of a you know, subjective. And so that's an example where you're kind of removing conflict from the coaching environment, and it just makes your life easier because you don't have those conflicts that you're dealing with. And so, you know, and stroke count can be valuable in a lot of different ways, but that's just one, you know, simple example.
And then that's the way you're often engaging, is a video call, or
Yeah, it can depend. And if you know, if groups want to do something, or a club wants to do something in more in depth, like we can go through and figure out what are the most important skills that swimmers need to learn at each step, and what are going to be the most effective strategies that you can, you know, that the club can use within the training context that they provide. And I think that's what's I think powerful about some of these ideas, is that they can be done in any sort of training context. So if you're an ultra short race pace training club, or you're, you know, a club that does 80,000 meters a week, you can use the same principles. It doesn't matter. And I think that that's what's particularly, you know, useful about them, is they can apply to any context.
Okay, so what's in your future? Or
Yeah.
do you want to, you know, get another coaching gig? What are your ambitions? Another book? What's
Yeah, so I think that for me, I really enjoy helping other coaches find success and solve the problems that they're facing. I really like the problem solving aspect of it, especially when coaches come to me, I have X, Y, and Z problem, especially when they're relatively novel problems and figuring that out. So I really like that aspect of it. I'm sure I'm going to get back into coaching on deck sooner than later. I'm not sure exactly what capacity that will take. But that is definitely something that's, I plan on doing in the near future. But I think that helping coaches is something that I really, really enjoy. And so I think that that's something that I will be continuing to do, certainly for the foreseeable future.
Well, I think the sport's lucky to have you and be able to call upon your wisdom and read the book. You're prolific with the emails. Do you have another book on tap?
Well, one thing I'm working on now is not so much a physical book, but making some digital stuff where it kind of goes through the strokes in more detail, and then kind of the specific strategies you can use within each stroke, and then also some of the big picture strategies, like I'm making something on stroke count, like how to use that, how to implement it, all the different ways you can do that, and the same thing with a couple other different big picture learning strategies that I like to use.
And things just became still here.
There.
I'm sorry, the internet just.
Yeah, I think
So you were talking about using digital tools to deliver some big picture strategies.
okay. Just pick up and go.
Yeah. Yeah, and then yeah, if there was anything else on your mind.
Yeah, sure. I'll just go where I started, and then you can just figure out the splicing, whatever. And so one of the things that I'm really trying to work on now is providing people with practical strategies and how to implement a lot of these ideas. And so going into more depth on the different ways that you can really be effective with helping shape skills. And as one example, kind of talked about it earlier. How do people actually, or how can coaches actually use stroke count in an effective way? And so it goes way beyond just counting strokes. There's all sorts of different strategies. And so I'm going through all of those different strategies. I'll show you how to design sets with that, and then give you, tons of examples of sets in different contexts, and different strokes, so that people can learn and coaches can learn how to apply these ideas. And so I'm trying to make things as practical as possible, because ultimately that's what coaches need, is they need to be able to know how to do something. And so I think a lot of times there's ideas that we hear about, but there's not always help for how to actually use them. And so that's where I'm focused on now.
Sweet. What about the economics of it? Are you able to make a living doing this? Did the book make some monies for you? Is it where?
Yeah, and I think the future for sure is. I think a problem that clubs face is that, like we talked about earlier, is that they're having trouble retaining swimmers. And I think what's going to be really important for changing that is providing them with tools for helping, if, like we talked about, if swimmers are continuing to improve, they're much more likely to stay engaged in the sport. And so helping, managing a club is really, really hard. And so there's a lot of times that it becomes difficult to create a progressive sequence all the way through from age 8 to age 18. And I think that that's where, things, it costs clubs money. And so there is value in establishing, not curriculum isn't the right word, but a progression for swimmers to learn these skills and really have a solid foundation, so that they're more likely to improve and continue to stay in the sport.
Yeah, well, that's a great way to provide value. The retention of the swimmers. What about the retention of the coaches too? I imagine.
Well, and that kind of ties back in, because the more financially viable the club is, the easier it's going to be, to pay and retain coaches too. And so I think a lot of it comes down to kind of economics, and if you can provide a better product to swimmers and families, they're more likely to to continue to retain those services.
Okay, then lastly, what about some relationships with USA Swimming, with foreign people, with different colleges and universities, or especially like I'm coming here is, the ISCA webmaster.
Yeah.
What type of, and you mentioned already working with NISCA a good bit, how do you see your best fit, especially perhaps with ISCA,
Yeah.
what can we do to help you, and how can you help us? How can we, help grow the sport?
Sure. And so I think, I haven't pursued that too heavily just because I'm trying to take one, one thing at a time. But I think what is valuable to me is certainly any type of exposure is going to be beneficial to me. And what I think that, I can help with from a, an organizational standpoint is just providing a resource for, because, with every organization, education is a huge part of what they do. And so providing, a different perspective on some of these, some of the skill development and the training stuff, I think can be valuable for coaches to see, because a lot of times, a lot of content can be pretty similar, and that's great because it reinforces what's been known to work. At the same time, having a different perspective can be really helpful for different coaches, especially ones that are, for whatever reason, struggling to, they're not happy with the results they're getting. Even if they're getting really great results, they want more. And so that can be valuable from that perspective.